This is my wrap up for the month of July, where I've read 8 books for this month. 5 of those were fiction and 3 were nonfiction. Overall, I think this reading month was a little middling for me. Nothing that I was compulsively reading with any of these books, which for me is always a sign of a lot of interest for me, as if I constantly want to keep picking it up. I wouldn't say really any of these books were doing that for me, but I did find quite a bit of value in what I did read. There were no bad books that I read this month, so we'll go through with them one at a time. Brother by David Chariandy. This is a fiction book set in the 1990s-ish in Toronto, Canada, and you're following a family of Trinidadian immigrants. They are living in poverty in this area that's sort of on the outskirts of the city, but still has a lot of characteristics of like inner city life. I'm not exactly sure, but to me it seemed like something akin to what we would call the projects in the United States. You follow 2 brothers and their mother. The father is absent and not a part of their lives, and in a way the mother is as well, as she's constantly out of the home working for the children, and then as we are in a later timeline, she is elderly and not well. The 2 brothers are named Michael and Francis, and you are in Michael's perspective, the younger brother, and he reveals to the reader pretty early on that something has happened to Francis. Francis is no longer with us, and it isn't immediately revealed to us why that is. Throughout the whole book, there's these undertones and also very blatant examples of violence towards these children, towards other kids and people of color in the neighborhood, that is perpetuated against them by other people, the community, and stereotyping, the police. Policing is a very heavy theme within this book. It's very short. I thought it was really well written. It was heartbreaking. I think that you get an idea very early on of what did happen to Francis, and it doesn't make it any more or less shocking or tragic when you come to find out the actual events that occurred. Overall, I thought this was a good book. Very short. I wish it was a bit longer. And the other thing I wish that this book gave us more of was that relationship with the mother. Most of this book is focused on the relationship between the 2 brothers, Francis and Michael. And as I mentioned, the mom is present, but in a way is removed a bit. And also maybe an emphasis on the grief the mother was going through with the loss of Francis. The next book I read was Spring by Ali Smith. This is the 3rd book in Ali Smith's seasonal quartet, which is so daunting to try and describe. A lot of Ali Smith's work for me, at least thus far for me, as I've really just been reading the seasonal quartet, it's difficult to describe beyond its themes. I would have to describe her books as distinctly very British in tone and humor and the politics that are being discussed. They are emphasizing the connectedness between people who are kind of your everyday people. There's nothing particularly remarkable about her characters. They are representative of, I think, a vast majority of people, though. The other thing that is kind of a through line within her work, at least within the seasonal quartet, is just this constant passage of time. That is something that is forever moving forward and moving on, and you have people who are experiencing the realities of time escaping and time fleeting and time passing. I thought that Spring was an alright book. It wasn't my favorite. I think for me, my favorite still is Autumn, the first one sequentially, though you can read these books out of order. I struggle a little bit with Ali Smith in that I feel like I need to be in the mood to read her work. She makes so many references to art and artists. In this one, Rilke is referenced a lot, who's someone I was familiar with, and then Catherine Mansfield, who I'm less familiar with. It's not that it's written in a difficult way to read. Her words have a lot of deeper meaning to them. I think Ali Smith is a difficult writer in that either I think you'll like her or you won't. I do quite like Ali Smith's writing, but I totally understand those who do not jive with it. So now I just have summer to read to complete the seasonal quartet. I don't know if I'm going to get to that this year. I've been taking my time in between her books, and I think I like it that way. I don't think I could deal with so much of Ali Smith's writing back to back. To me, it's a bit draining. But yeah, I'm continuing to enjoy this. I think that I appreciate, as I mentioned, how British these books are. Though she's talking about Brexit and the political climate in Britain, it is all so related to how things are in the United States. I think that there's so much relevancy to the politics that she is discussing within her works. Tortilla Flat by John Steinbeck is the next entry in Steinbeck's work that my friend Katie and I read together, and this one was an early work of Steinbeck's. It has some of his similar themes and settings that he has throughout. It has a lively cast of characters, and this is set in Monterey. You're following a group of paisanos, and it's just a bunch of men. They are all single and are broke, trying to get by, but not really trying too hard. They just want to make enough to buy the next bottle of wine, essentially. They're constantly drunk, they're kind of bumbling around, and it's a good, entertaining read. I don't think it is Steinbeck's best, but I still think it is good. I like Steinbeck's writing. I think that there's a lot of humor in this book, more humor than in a lot of his other books. It is inspired by Arthurian legend, which you see in the dialogue as well, where they are using these like really old words that sound like dated and funny coming out of the mouths of these like drunken paisanos who are just like constantly drinking wine, talking about women, and like hoping they don't have to end up paying money to people they owe, essentially. So another entry in Steinbeck's work, and another one I'm happy to have read. This was my first time reading Tortilla Flat. The Undocumented Americans by Karla Cornejo Villavivicencio. This is a nonfiction book that is about undocumented Americans. It came out in 2020, and at that time I had heard of it and knew that I wanted to read it, and it hadn't come back around to my attention until recently, which I could see as its relevancy is, again, increasingly relevant with the political climate in the United States and the crackdowns on immigrants or perceived immigrants, legal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, all sorts of people that Trump is targeting under his administration. This takes the approach of following your everyday person. The author makes a point of that because so many stories surrounding undocumented immigrants are saturated with these stories of someone really deserving to be here because of their achievement or accomplishment or something about them. And her point is to steer away from that. People are not deserving of things because of their accomplishments. They're deserving of freedoms and safety because they're human. And that is so important for us to understand. And it's something that so many people are lacking when it comes to this conversation about who should be allowed here and who can come into this country. We shouldn't be equating people's value to their perceived achievements and greatness. People are valuable because they are humans. And I think that this book does such a good job at making that so clear through these personal stories of people that our author has spent a lot of time with. She also takes a unique approach in that she isn't removed from these people who are her subjects. As a journalist, you are taught to have this distance, which is for good reason a lot of times, and to not entangle your lives with your subjects. our author here is honest in that she has given money to these people. She has close relationships with them. She is not treating these people as just people to be observed. She is alongside them, living their experience and learning through them their experiences to share with us. Something new I learned in this book was about sanctuary laws, or like rules essentially, that allow people who are undocumented to stay in a place of worship for protection. She followed a man's story who was taken in by his church's congregation and allowed to live there while he was completing his necessary documentation to make him a legal immigrant. That's something I haven't been made aware of, and I'm curious as to what the status of that is today, if that's been taken away from people, how many people are utilizing that, and how many churches or congregations are like stepping up to provide that for people when it's so needed. I'm really happy that I got to this book, even though it took me quite a few years after first hearing about it, and it ended up in my possession in such a wonderful way, as it was lent to me by a close friend who has done close work with immigrants, not people who are coming to the United States, but people who were crossing from the Venezuelan border into Colombia. And I really appreciated getting to talk to her about this book, her perspective, her take on it, and also her experiences. The Factory by Hiroko Oyamada, translated by David Boyd. This is a short novel that is fiction, though it has just a slight bit of magical realism. I'm hesitant to even say that because it's so minor, but there is a bit of surrealism going on in this book. It follows 3 Japanese workers who get a job at the factory. And it isn't clear to us what the factory is even producing or doing, other than that they have a lot of employees and there's many tasks to do. However, none of these tasks have any sort of meaning to them. We have these 3 characters who are all assigned different roles, and they are going about their daily working life. It's very mundane, dull, boring. Lifeless is a great word for their experience, and also just how the book felt a bit sucked of life, which I'm sure is purposeful given the critique of corporate culture and the workplace, which the author is intending with their work. The book stylistically is written in these really huge chunks of text. Even though it's so short, it feels quite long and bloated because nothing is really happening. Our characters are slightly aware of it, but at the same time are completely complacent with what's going on around them. I was most interested by a character who was tasked to research moss, essentially, for a green roofing project for the factory. They're the only one assigned to this task, though it's a humongous undertaking. And they were assigned this with the full knowledge of that there is no timeline. It's a pretty much impossible task for one person to get done. My frustrations with work were definitely felt by this novel in ways. But overall, like, it's hard because the reading of the novel was so dull and lifeless, like pointedly, that it just wasn't exciting to me. I wasn't really into it, and the ending I found anticlimactic and just really unsatisfactory, which I think, again, goes to the author's point of what they're trying to say about, workplace and the mundanity of that. But yeah, I can't say I was in love with this book. Resisting Erasure, Capital, Imperialism, and Race in Palestine by Adam Hanif, Rob Knox, and Rafif Ziada. This is a book that's coming out soon, in August actually, and I read an e-arc of this, and it is very short and has a very distinct purpose, and that is to make the connections between the global imperial powers, settler colonialism, and capitalism that is all allowing and propping up Israel to continue to commit a genocide against the Palestinian people and take their land, exploit their labor, and just cause so much harm to people. It's really accessible and not hard to read. If you're wanting to understand how foreign powers are propping up Israel to allow this to happen, this book will be incredibly valuable to you. Not only talks about recent events, but historically, things that have gone on, laws that have been put into place to allow this to continue to happen and to be supported by so many of these foreign countries. This book also talks about the exploitation of Palestinian labor by Israelis and the Israeli government, which I thought was valuable and not something I'd read in other texts. So I think that was also especially relevant to my understanding. I then read Bibliophobia by Chihaya, which was one of my most anticipated books to read this year, just given its content. It's a memoir about an author, a writer, and her experience with reading and developing bibliophobia, which is the fear of books or reading. For some people, this can be related to speaking, for others, reading. That in itself is really fascinating to me as someone who loves books so deeply, and I really have a lifestyle around reading and talking about books, and it's something that I value so highly. Imagining being in that situation myself was particularly terrifying. Chihaya takes reading super seriously. She is a professor and she reads books, writes for a living. And so getting into this situation really was so traumatic for her. She talks about how reading and specific books have deeply affected her mental health and her emotional well-being, which is something that I personally don't relate to, though I read so many emotionally heavy books. I mean, I do in a way where, of course, I'm emotionally moved and I'm affected by these things that I'm reading, but nowhere near to the extent of what had overcome Chihaya with reading. She talks about books in particular. They're at different formative times in her life. She talks a bit about her childhood in here. She talks about being a professor, and she talks about being a writer. Parts of me really struggled with this book in that I am really uncomfortable reading people's accounts of their mental breakdowns and mental health struggles. Depression is talked about extensively in here, and it's not an unfamiliar topic to me. It's deeply personal to me. And I think that's why it maybe makes me so uncomfortable sometimes. Something that I need to reconcile within myself, and I also just may not be the one to read this kind of book too often, or at least subject myself to reading these books too often, because I don't think I like the experience for myself personally. She talks a lot about The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, A Tale for a Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, both of which are books that I've really loved, particularly Ruth Ozeki's book. I absolutely adore that book, and that is a fiction novel that does deal quite deeply with depression and suicide. I found most interesting the sections that were about those books that I'd read and also felt moved by. But yeah, overall, I have mixed feelings about this book and the way that it made me feel. I am someone who does value taking reading pretty seriously. I like to read heavy books. I like to then think about them deeply. And I would say reading for me is definitely pleasurable. I read for pleasure. I read because I want to read. But also, I treat reading as learning. There are more intellectual ways to approach reading than others. Not that one way or another is inherently good or bad, but just different approaches to reading. While I find myself similar to Chihaya in some ways of her approach, there's other ways where I feel I do not relate to her reading experiences in the way that she consumes and reads books. So yeah, something I was really looking forward to, slightly disappointed by, but glad that I read it. And then the final book I read was Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins, the third book in the original trilogy of The Hunger Games. This was a reread for me. I read these books many, many times when I was much younger. I'm now recalling why when I was younger I reread The Hunger Games and Catching Fire a lot, but I oftentimes wouldn't reread Mockingjay. And it's because Mockingjay is boring. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but Mockingjay is just slow. I think the pacing is off in Mockingjay. The first 3/4 of the book primarily take place in District 13. District 13 is not that interesting. And yes, it's probably because we're mostly like separated from the conflict that's going on, which is for reasons. And I do think overall, like, you know, the plot and the story arc is great. And I think the ending is also good in this book. It's just bogged down by this beginning section, which I particularly don't care for. So this was more of a like, glad I reread it, but a reminded of why it isn't my favorite in the series. That was it for July. Those were my 8 books. And August, I'm already getting a lot of books done, so I'm excited about what I'm reading, and I'm reading some books right now that I'm really, really enjoying. So I think August will be a bit more lively with stuff that I am, you know, just gushing with love for and overwhelmingly enjoyed. So I'm excited to share those with you soon. Let me know what you thought of any of these books, if you've read them, if you want to read any of them, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.